Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the LNG Academy. My name is Nadir Meratla. I'm Director of LNG at OgeeDev. Um, Today, we have a very special guest, Karen Ogen from the LNG First Nations LNG Alliance. Karen, uh, you've been CEO of the First Nations Alliance since 2015. Karen's also elected chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation community from 2010 to 2016. One of the 35 most influential women in British Columbia, and one of recognized three First Nations women in leadership within LNG. Karen, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadir. The pleasure is mine as well.
Karen, a lot of our listeners and clients are overseas, as you're intimately aware. LNG is a very global business. Could you please explain to our audience who are the First Nations LNG Alliance? What do they do? Who are their members? And just introduce it to people who are perhaps not familiar with the landscape here in Canada.
So we started the First Nations LNG Alliance. It was an idea where when we started it was at a controversial time for the Wet'suwet'en people, and we wanted people to know what LNG is and what it isn't, and our people could make their own informed decision whether they support LNG or not. So we really wanted to ensure that we get the messaging out in terms of the environment, how important the environment is to us, how we are viewed as the stewards of the land, and also the other polarized piece is the economy. How is this going to build our economy? How is it going to build our people within our communities? So we wanted to ensure that we are advocating for the highest environmental standards, at the same time advocating for our economy. So we want to make sure that the projects that we are supporting are responsible, and that there's going to be some give back to the communities in ways of resources, of ways of equity, of ways of loan guarantees. So I think we wanted to, not only inform our people, but the rest of BC, Canada, and the world on who we are, what we do. Our board members are made up of primarily Indigenous leaders from our communities. Uh, we are a national organization, so we have membership from Alberta as well, Northern BC, Vancouver Island, and also Newfoundland, the Mi'kmaq First Nation. So we are a national organization that is advocating for LNG across Canada.
Oh, that's so important. Can you maybe just touch on how the LNG Alliance has been involved a bit more specifically on some of the projects here? I know, for example, Karen, as back end of last year, you came back from a 5-day trade mission. For example, in China, we were just speaking about Cedar LNG taking FID, and they had their ceremony, I believe, a couple of weeks back.
Yeah.
For that project. Maybe you could just talk about what's currently going on right now, and maybe touch on the trade mission, and as well your attendance at the FID ceremony for Cedar.
At the end of June, I was invited as a witness to witness the final investment decision being made by Pembina and Cedar LNG, which is majority owned by the Haisla. So they are making history here in Canada and in BC and in northern BC, which is probably the first major project that has been majority owned by First Nations. So that in itself is economic reconciliation. We continue to talk about it, but this is a fine example of what Indigenous people mean by economic reconciliation. And that term comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on how we advance First Nations despite our history. So I think that this is the best thing that could have happened for First Nations in BC and northern BC. And the trade mission to China that I attended last October, I was invited, I was chosen, 10 First Nations people were chosen across Canada to attend this trade mission, with the Canada-China Business Council. And a part of that was to speak with investors about potential projects here in BC and Canada, whether it be energy, hydrogen, clean energy projects, and LNG. There is still a very, very high demand for LNG in China and Asian countries. So that is a strong message that I continue to bring back, is that Canada has a resource that we need, or that the rest of the world needs, and we have the answers to that. For me, from my perspective, it looks like to build our economy here in Canada, we not only build the economy in First Nations communities, but it is also assisting those countries that are lacking the energy resources that we have. So it's a win-win across the board for everyone.
I couldn't agree more than that, especially, Karen, when you go out to China or you go out to, these highly populated, countries, and you see the extent that burning dirty fuels is causing on people, very real impact, which I think LNG plays a very key role in the transition. Karen, what do you think is different this time? We get asked this question quite often from our international clients, but what do you see different? I know you've been a part of the LNG Alliance since 2015, CEO. What do you see different today that you didn't see in 2015, 16? Well, what are we doing differently in Canada that is enabling some of these projects to go ahead? We got LNG Canada coming online this year. We got wood fiber making good progress. Cedar LNG, as you mentioned, you've attended the FID ceremony last week. It is different today. Good things are happening.
Yeah.
What do you think is causing that?
Well, I believe that, and it continues to go back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on how Canada must help advance Indigenous people. And how we do that is through economic reconciliation, which is part of the recommendations out of that report. And so if a community like Haisla or the Nisga'a people want LNG, which we view as a cleaner fossil fuel that will help Asian countries get off of coal, I really believe that by BC and Canada working along the desires and of these communities, which is community driven, I think that we, as a country, we need to continue to support Indigenous people with whatever projects that they so choose. And I think that's very helpful. It's a win for the climate. It's a win for these countries that have higher emissions, like China, the US, and India. Those are the three highest emitters in the world. And so by us selling our LNG to these countries, it's helping them bring down their emissions, which is really looking at things from a global perspective, and being able to, think globally and act locally. So that means getting our LNG to port to deliver to these countries so that it's a win across the board.
Right. And Karen, in your opening remarks, you spoke a little bit about my interpretation is what is cornerstone to reconciliation. Doing real measures of reconciliation that yield something positive. Maybe you could touch on the training component. Are you seeing any of that at the moment, and how important is training and competency management and developing the skills? How important is that to, what you're seeing today in terms of reconciliation?
Well, I think capacity building within our communities is very, very important. A lot of our opposition tell us that these projects are fly-by-night and that they'll come and go within a year or two. But what we want, the outcome, is to have our people to get into the trades, to get into all of these different training fields, because in order to build capacity within our communities, we need people in finance, we need people in, whether it be social work or MBAs, and working, the environmental assessment piece. I think being guardians of the land, being able to have these positions long beyond the construction of the pipeline. So it's important to communities where we want to build the capacity to be able to do these jobs within our community and on the construction of these pipelines. And so that's been a main push for a lot of the Indigenous communities, that we build that capacity, that we continue to build upon that for the years to come beyond the construction of the pipeline.
So just coming back to reconciliation and what is meaningful, in terms of yielding positive results. Um, of course, every LNG project has a gas component of feed gas,
Yeah.
be it tapping directly into a pipeline or running a new pipeline. Maybe you could talk about Coastal GasLink in the context of empirical evidence of what you've seen through that. What evidence today supports that you see material reconciliation on that project, and what was your experience?
So when I was the chief between 2010 and 2016, I signed a provincial agreement and an agreement with the company Coastal GasLink. And now today, those communities, our community among the 20, are reaping the benefits today. They're seeing those revenues come to the community, and what we spelled out for our community, because we needed to come up with a plan, like what are we going to do once we get this money into our community. So we have 4 pillars that were put up when I was the chief that we thought were important to us. So education and training. Residential schools is a bad mark, a black mark on our history. So we want to be able to turn that around and start to build capacity within our communities. So we want to, whatever post-secondary funds that Indigenous Service Canada gives to us, we want to top that up with the funds that we get to help advance our students in post-secondary, in trades, training, what have you. So we want to turn that around in our community. The other piece is health and wellness. Because of the history of our people having dealt with intergenerational trauma, and having it passed down through the generations, we also want to turn that around. We want to have people start to deal with their unresolved trauma, um, have a health plan in our community where people are being able to access services where we haven't been able to before. Whatever First Nations Health Authority delivers, we want to be able to top that up for our community members to access trauma counseling, grief counseling. We want to turn the social issues around in our communities. And the third one is language and culture. Right now, as I speak, we have 2 fluent speakers in our community that aren't doing well health-wise. We want to be able to revitalize our language so that we have 100% of our people speaking fluently. So we have to have more programs and services that will help our community members be able to speak their language. The other piece is housing. Housing has been an issue right from I can remember. So now we're seeing more and more housing within our community. So those are tangible ways where communities are reaping the benefits from these agreements that were signed almost 10 years ago.
Got it. Maybe you could touch a little bit on the members of the First Nations LNG Alliance and say, I'm a project. How would I work with the First Nations LNG Alliance?
So we've had Chief Crystal Smith as part of our board and chair for a majority of the years that she's been involved with the Alliance. We had the Coastal GasLink pipeline that was very controversial for our people, but part of the role of a hereditary chief is to look after the people in the land. And so when you look at these elected councils, their roles are similar. We must look after the people and also share in the responsibility of caring for the land. And so, whether it's a colonial construct, the Indian Act, that's the only authority that we have at the moment until another form of governance comes into play. So what we need to do is continue to work with communities that have both forms of traditional leadership and like the legal jurisdiction, the Indian Act, both parties must work together. And so we come alongside Haisla and continue to promote their projects and all of the benefits to the community, that whole notion of equity ownership, the loan guarantees that are coming through by the province of BC, with Canada. We're seeing more and more of that here in Canada. That's helping to push major projects along to get them to completion. That's what we're seeing different. 10 years ago, there was no talk of equity ownership. 10 years ago, there was no talk of any loan guarantees being provided to First Nations. So we're in a movement right now where we're hoping to see First Nations build their capacity to the point of ownership on these major projects.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Cedar is just such a great example. You know, to see 51% ownership of the Haisla on a major LNG project. And, you know, to some degree, I think I asked you a question that I've answered and you've answered. I already knew the answer, but,
Yeah.
you know, when I was asking you, what is different, Karen, this time? To me, what kind of stands out is the participation of First Nations into the projects, real participation, not nominal. The participation, equity, involvement into the project seems to be clearly something that is materially different to when projects were not going ahead. Projects aren't going ahead now in British Columbia. And I think that sounds like it sits right part and parcel.
Well, I think part of the history is that First Nations have had to continuously go to court. There's only over 500 court cases that tell us that we are the rights and title of the land and territories. So it's through those methods that has got us to the table. In the 1950s, we weren't even at the table. We had major projects going right by our territories, highways, transmission lines, railways, pipelines, where we had absolutely no say. And today, we have a say. We have a seat at the table. We have a say, and you know, there's that whole notion of equity ownership that's on the table. So I think we've come a long way, and that's through advocacy, through continuously voicing our concerns, having to bring issues to the court where we get told, yes, you do have a say. Yes, you do have rights. So I think it's come a long way, and we're here today. You're seeing more and more nations negotiating equity ownership deals. You're seeing more nations moving forward with the loan guarantee programs. So I think that is going to help advance Indigenous people, not only in BC, but Canada.
Yeah, and another important element that you've touched on is the financing aspect that is available to some of these projects through First Nations funding.
Yeah.
Maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
Well, I think that BC, with their $1 billion loan guarantee for First Nations in BC, that's just the start. Because when you look at the landscape of Indigenous people in Canada, we have 600 First Nations across Canada. 204 are in BC. So will the $1 billion be sufficient? Probably not, but that's a start. You look at Canada as a whole, they've given $5 billion to Indigenous people. Again, that's a start. Because in Alberta, their government has given First Nations in Alberta $3 billion. And they don't have as much First Nations as we do in BC. So we see that as a start. Alberta seems to have the leading edge in terms of the loan guarantee programs and what it takes to get First Nations to ownership on these major projects. So I think they're leading the way. I've seen the Aboriginal Investment Opportunities Corporation help with the deal with 23 First Nations with Enbridge. That in itself is a feat. That is something that a lot of the First Nations, not only in BC but Canada, want to aspire to, where you have a collective of First Nations coming together to say yes to a deal. That in itself is very It's something to be achieved by First Nations and industry and companies that want to help advance nations.
Right. And maybe just for our listeners, I will point out that what you're referring to, I believe, Karen, is there is funding available through the provinces and federally to projects for First Nations to take an equity stake, in which the government, at either provincial or federal level, will provide a guarantee to secure the loan. Is that essentially
Yes.
what you're talking about in terms of, I think it's an important aspect of actually how these projects get off the ground,
Yes.
especially for the more smaller, mid-scale size LNG projects that we're seeing. Cedar, for example, I would put as mid-scale with fiber. So a lot about LNG project development, Karen, is about timing. And actually, how competitive is a particular LNG project or a region of LNG projects compared to a different region that is in the mix at any given time, right? A lot of people are saying that the U.S. administration pause on LNG actually is opening up an opportunity for Canada to make an actual impact on the climate initiatives and a change in places like China and India, etc. What do you see as that being an opportunity versus not an opportunity?
It definitely is an opportunity for Canada because Canada is rich in natural resources. We supply the world, or we can potentially supply the world with a lot of our natural resources. Right now, as we speak, Canada sells our LNG to the US and they reap the benefits of it. Canada is in a position where we can deliver our LNG to Asia within 10 days, as opposed to the US. They have to go through the Panama Canal, which is much longer. It takes longer to get the LNG to market. So that's an advantage for Canada. It'll be lower on costs. It'll help our economy in Canada and the provinces. So I think we have a window of opportunity here that will not only help Canada, but the Indigenous peoples that are on these major projects. So I think that's a win-win-win across the board for Asian countries and European countries.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from you, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, is the fundamentals actually haven't changed. And the fundamentals are Canada's rich in resources, natural gas in particular in the context of LNG.
Yeah.
And its proximity to the high value markets of Asia are fundamentally or structurally the foundation of why these projects make sense.
We're in the right place at the right time.
Right place, right time. Timing is certainly a key element. But let's not forget one of the oldest LNG plants that's been in operation for decades, the Kenai LNG facility just up the coast in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. There's a reason why that was one of the earliest projects that went ahead in LNG.
Yeah.
And people often forget that's a U.S. LNG export project developed in the 60s. But the proximity between there and the highest value market, Tokyo Bay, was such that the project made sense. And to me, the fundamentals of BC, along with it being, low political risk, I would say, make it a very favorable time for it to actually reap the benefits. So Karen, just kind of wrapping things up, are there any challenges, and I know you and I have spoken about this, Karen, in terms of being an advocacy group, right? It's always a challenge to, how do you fund it? How do you secure, the right resources, both people, money, whatever it may be? What's your greatest challenge at the moment? And what would help you in terms of taking the next step?
Well, right now, the province of BC hasn't funded us. Normally, both them and NRCan, the federal government, have funded us, but it's come to the place of funding our organization. 10 years ago, we were funded fully by both levels of government. And now we're relying on our affiliate membership. So we have 4 companies that help us, but it's not to the point where we need, because we start to do international trips as well.
Yeah.
We're getting invited to different countries to speak to their governments and to speak to investors. So I think that because we've taken on the role of the Canadian LNG Alliance, it's become broader, we've become national, and we travel internationally. So funding is an issue. Another challenge that we're facing is now with the whole notion of Bill C-59,
Hmm.
where it is wanting to silence us in speaking about how LNG offsets coal in other countries that brings down emissions. So I think by that messaging, it's trying to silence us. And I feel like as an Indigenous person, we know all too well oppressive legislation. We've lived it our whole lives, and we've had to fight against it. It's human rights, that whole issue. So Indigenous people know all too well oppressive legislation, and we continue to advocate. We continue to advocate on the ground, saying this is what we want, this is what our people need, and we're going to continue with the messaging.
That's very powerful, Karen. Um, Karen, is there anything else that you would like to add in terms of messaging to our viewers who are not, say, familiar with the landscape here in Canada in terms of LNG project development? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that Canada is open for business. Uh, we continued with the motto at our LNG 2023 conference where we talked about Canadian LNG is Indigenous LNG. So we need Indigenous people at the table in order for these projects to move forward. So we're open for business.
Canadian LNG is an Indigenous LNG.
Yeah.
I think that's extremely well put. Thank you, Karen. This has been a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. And thank you for all your contributions and your hard work. Will you be a guest at this year?
Yes.
Please come say hello to Karen. Come by Solaris booth and say hello at Gastech. To all our listeners out there, we'll catch you on the next episode of LNG Academy.